afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Welcome to the session entitled Impact of Carbon Offsets on the California Market. I'm Nancy Sutley. I'm the Senior Assistant General Manager of External and Regulatory Affairs and Chief Sustainability Officer at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and very pleased to be your moderator today. I will quickly introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. So starting with Jason Gray, who is filling in ably, I'm sure, for Shelby Livingston from the Air Resources Board. And Jason is the Chief of the Climate Change Program Evaluation Branch at the California Air Resources Board, and he oversees implementation of the Cap and Trade program. So welcome, Jason, and thank you for jumping in. We're also joined by John Costantino, who is founder and principal of Tradesman Advisor, and he has a lot of experience with the Cap and Trade program and experience at the California Air Resources Board. So we're very glad to have John join us today. And finally, last but not least, Robert Parkhurst, who is the founder of Sierra View Solutions, and he helps companies design and implement environment, sustainability, and circular economy programs. And he has experience with the Environmental Defense Fund and Pacific Gas and Electric. So we are very glad to have everybody join us now. So why don't I just give you a little bit of an overview of what we're try to accomplish with this panel. So we're now 8 years into the California Cap and Trade program, and the program is still utilizing the same protocols when it began. So there's some uncertainty with the future and the size and the impact of the compliance offset program, given some new restrictions that have come into place. So we'll try to look in this session at the market dynamics and the political context around the offset program, and as well as the recently finalized recommendations of the Offset Protocol Task Force. So let me kick it off by asking Jason, from the perspective of the Air Resources Board, what is the role of carbon offsets going forward, and what will the plan be looking at in terms of offsets? So we'll do one general overview round with everybody, and then get into some more questions. So Jason, if you can, in a few minutes, sort of give us a little bit of an update and an outlook from the Air Resources Board.
Sure, thanks, Nan. Hope everyone can hear me. All right, thanks. And it's a pleasure to be at NACW today. I'm happy to be filling in for Shelby Livingston. Shelby is newly coming back to my group as the head of our offsets unit. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to join at the last minute today. So I will do my best to fill in for her. Nancy, I think I'll just provide a kind of quick status update, if that works, as well as some of the new pieces that have come into legislation several years ago, but just took effect earlier this year, if that makes sense. So as you say, we have been utilizing the same 6 offset protocols for several years now. Under those 6 protocols, though, we have issued quite a number of credits. So we have our U.S. Forest Protocol, our Livestock Protocol, an ODS Destruction Protocol, our Mine Methane Protocol, as well as urban forests and rice cultivation, which we're yet to see a project, but that would be great. But under those other 4 protocols, we've had 400 projects from about 38 states, maybe more now, actually, throughout the U.S. And of that, that's generated more than 220 million offset credits, representing real additional permanent reductions. So even under these protocols we have so far, that's a really significant climate benefit. So we're proud of that. We're proud of the stringency of the program, and I think that just speaks well to interest in the program so far. Within those credits, folks have used about 93 million as part of their retirements for compliance with cap and trade to date. We have a big compliance period. At the end of our last compliance period, surrender date coming up in November. So we'll see what folks are doing with that. I also just want to say on kind of the partnership approach for offsets, this is really the purpose, not just from a cost containment perspective, but from a climate diplomacy and from a climate strategy perspective, is really helping push reductions in sectors that are not in the cap and driving innovation and incentives. And that's really from a wide variety of project developers, from a wide variety of land ownerships for the forest protocol, and a really wide variety of interests. In particular, I would just want to highlight the relationships that we've been able to create with tribal and Alaska Native corporations under the forest protocol, which represent about 50% of our overall offset credits coming from tribal and Alaska Native corporation lands. And I think the use of the incentives coming from this program really are helping tribes and Alaska Native corporations and a lot of their other climate and co-benefit from conservation perspective, from cultural perspectives, from reacquiring traditional lands. I mean, hugely beneficial. So I'll just highlight that. I think I'll highlight as well that our program continues to face a lot of scrutiny. I think that's just a reality. And I'll highlight that there seems to be just recently kind of a rehashing of some of the arguments that have been raised in the past on some media articles that are looking to critique the program based on kind of a redefinition from the article's perspectives on how to define additionality. This is really not looking at how we define additionality, but kind of trying to hold us to a different type of standard. And I'll just note from our perspective, this program has really been premised on rigor. It's been premised on developing an implementable and practical program that meets the standards and requirements of law, including on how we define additionality. And that's been upheld by the courts, and I think we stand firmly behind that. But I just wanted to note that because there seems to be kind of a new suite of these types of just articles coming out. For new developments, the direct environmental benefits development from a market perspective is something new the legislature has imposed in the program. And we developed regulatory requirements to effectuate that legislative mandate. That mandate kicked in earlier this year in terms of offsets being able to be designated as DEBs, direct environmental benefits, or not. The obligation requirements for that really, excuse me, kick in with the surrender of obligations for 2021 emissions. So DEBs exist now in our system. The obligations on restrictions of DEBs versus non-DEBs, that kicks in when people start surrendering for this year's emissions next year, if that makes sense. So for folks that are surrendering for their 2020 and earlier emissions this coming November, the DEBs requirements are not applicable to those. But we have started to designate DEBs credits in the system based on the legislation and based on the definition coming from the legislation, which really means that an offset that provides additional benefits, the reduction or avoidance of emissions of any air pollutant, or reduction or avoidance of any pollutant that could have an adverse impact on waters of the state. That's the definition. If it meets those definitions, or that definition, we will flag it as a DEBs credit. And of our 220 million credits so far issued in the program, 42 million have already been designated as meeting that DEBs requirement. So just a point of context in terms of numbers. Before I briefly touch on the Offsets Protocol Task Force, which I think Robert's going to touch on more, I wanted to mention two things. One related to offsets, which is, as the market operator, the market implementer, I'm not going to be able to talk about, here's a future date for any changes or for new protocol types. That's not what we do. You guys have seen me give that same spiel every year, so I'll say it again. But I am interested to hear how others are talking about it and try to field some questions. The other piece I'll say is more programmatically related. We're very pleased that yesterday, the Ninth Circuit has dismissed the pending U.S. lawsuit against California for our linkage with Quebec. So that was a great news. come out on Earth Day. And it really just highlights that the dismissal and our successful defense in the district court affirms the design of the program. So the strength of the program, the design of the program, and the requirement and necessity of having partners. So our linkage with Quebec, that climate partnership approach I just talked about with respect to offset projects, that's critical to address the climate crisis. All right, so Robert, I'm about to kick it over back to Nancy and over to you, but we did have the Offset Protocol Task Force, an incredible amount of work from all the task force members, and we're really grateful for that. And I think Robert's going to talk more about that when he starts talking. So I'll stop for now.
Great, thank you so much. It was a good day for California when it comes to Earth Day. Vehicle stand will strengthen California's program. So and let me turn now to Rob, who was a member of the offset program. Talk a little.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you to the Climate Action Reserve and NACW for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to expand just a little bit on the great background that Nancy gave and the outline that Jason gave up. Part of my practice has really been focused on farmers, ranchers, and forest owners and environmental markets. So I work now at the intersection between policy, environmental markets, and agriculture. I was really involved in the Rice Protocol, and I think I can speak for anyone that was involved in that. We learned a lot in that process. It is now about to reach its 6th anniversary, and Jason's right. There haven't been any credits from it, and we can go into the details on that if people are interested. But I wanted to focus, my comments here on the Offset Task Force, and so the Offset Task Force it came out of AB or Assembly Bill 398, which was passed in 2016. And the goal of that task force was to provide the ARB with recommendations on establishing new protocols for the cap and trade program, right? Including consideration of direct environmental benefits and prioritizing disadvantaged communities, Native American or tribal lands, and rural and agricultural regions. The task force was also required to consider the development of protocols that focused on management or conservation of agricultural and natural lands, and for the enhancement and restoration of wetlands. There were 13 members representing the scientific community, air pollution districts, carbon markets, tribes, the environmental justice sector, labor, agriculture, dairies, and the public. We met 3 public meetings to outline the recommendations. And at the first meeting, the task force divided itself into 6 subgroups to investigate specific areas. And then we had a second meeting to discuss some of the details of the recommendations, and then a final meeting to wrap everything up. And so at the second meeting, we had a draft report that came out. This was, the work here was all of experts in the field. ARB did not put their thumb on the scale in any way. I think like the most that they did was to help us with an outline on it, to give us some direction. So the different sections of the report generally look and read the same. And I apologize to Jason and to Paul and to other people on his team for some of the differing approaches that people took. They did a phenomenal job of bringing it together and herding us cats. So the final report, it was issued on March 2nd of this year. It was a whopping 200 pages and ended up having 5 chapters. And the 5 chapters were, the first one focused on overarching recommendations. And so some of the recommendations that came out of that section were changes to the way invalidation is considered, recommendations on providing loans to Native American tribes and disadvantaged communities and rural and agricultural projects, as well as looking into aggregation and how to bring small landowners together into larger projects. The second chapter was focused on blue carbon and wetlands, and that one had a recommendation to look at the American Carbon Registry's restoration of California deltaic and coastal wetlands, their methodology for potential consideration by ARB. The third chapter of the report was all focused on forestry. It had a large number of recommendations. And some of the summary of what was in there was expanded eligibility for projects, some of geographic eligibility, updates to the common practice baseline, updates to how project boundaries are considered, how some of the easements are thought about, and the sampling for the ongoing monitoring of projects. The fourth chapter, this is the one that I should have mentioned at the beginning. I was the representative from the agriculture community, and myself and JP Cataviella from Cogent co-chaired the working group that focused on livestock, agriculture, and rangelands. And the recommendations that came out of that section were to consider protocols around the avoided conversion of grasslands, enteric fermentation, and alternative manure management practices. So essentially taking the CDFA's program and merging it with the livestock protocol and working upstream of manure. The fifth and final chapter was on the other three protocols, urban forestry, ozone depleting substances, and mine methane capture. And some of the recommendations in there were just some modification of those protocols to streamline them and to bring more more projects into the market, such as adding new refrigerant types to the ODS protocol like R22 and I think HFC 134A. And then in closing, I'm going to riff a bit on kind of the agriculture side because it's been a theme throughout this conference. We heard it from Lisa in the opening plenary. Nat Cohane mentioned it in the last section, and the ag sector is one of the biggest opportunities, in my view, to see new projects. But we've got a challenge. At the Food and Ag Policy Summit on March 22nd, USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack said that the carbon market is not designed and set up for farmers. And he's right. If you look at about the 138 million outstanding voluntary carbon credits out there, less than 2.5 million are crop-based agriculture. And if you add in livestock, I think you can get up to closer to 7 million. It's still just a fraction. And so there are more than 20 different offset standards out there that credit agricultural practices, but only 8 of them have produced a single credit. And so one of my call to actions to the community out here is that the USDA has published a notice of request for public comment related to the executive order tackling climate change at home and abroad. And it's asked for feedback on policies and programs to encourage voluntary adoption of agriculture practices that sequester carbon, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and ensure resiliency to climate change. It's geared to request feedback for USDA to increase participation by the ag sector in carbon markets. And comments are due a week from yesterday. So I encourage everyone out there to look at that, to provide it. The last check was about 2 days ago, was only 1,200 comments. I really encourage folks, there's a lot of really thoughtful people that attend this conference to weigh in on this, because I think it's an important area. So I'll step back off my soapbox and hand it back to Nancy and John to continue on.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. That was fascinating. And I think we get a little more into sort of what California has learned are for national policy issues, including some that you raised. So we'll maybe get into that in a little bit. But I want to turn now to John. And certainly the offset issues have gotten a lot of attention in the legislature. And so wanted to see if you could comment on sort of how the legislature is thinking about carbon offsets. What have they done? What are the issues that are sort of raised by some of that, and then you know, why do offsets still matter? So John.
Thanks. John Costantino. Want to thank NACW for hosting this. Want to thank Robert and everybody on the offset protocol task force. That was a lot of work. And Jason, your team. I was part of it on the fringe, and thankfully not too deep into it because it was a lot of work. So the legislature took a very serious look at offsets in 2017 when AB 398 was debated. And the environmental community, the environmental justice community, the industrial stakeholders, all were part of that discussion. And what came out of it was a reduction in the offset usage limit from 8% down to 4%. It'll kick back up to 6% in a couple years. But that was a very thoughtful review, and it took a lot of people, a lot of time, a lot of debate to sort of find the sweet spot for where the policy should be. And as Jason said, that is just now starting. And so last year there was a little bit of an issue with cap and trade. There was a few key stakeholders in the legislature who wanted to revisit that debate. Last year was pretty busy with COVID and everything that was going on. And I think some of the cap and trade stakeholders didn't really see that this was an issue until now. The ARB is committed, and the Secretary to the cap and trade program, and that review will happen under the guise, the umbrella of the scoping plan, which, depending on the committee applications this week, they're not, the board can get approval of those membership by the May board meeting. We may see scoping plan work starting in June. And when that scoping plan work starts in June, we're definitely going to be talking about offsets, and we're definitely going to be talking about EJ and cap and trade. The legislature this year, there's a couple of stakeholders who keep wanting to push the issue, but again, with the scoping plan, cap and trade, and everything sort of pending and just starting the 2021 second phase of the program, there's really not a lot of interest in revisiting those fights from a couple years ago. It's a big effort. It takes a lot of people thinking about it. So offsets really are not, there's no offset bills that I know of. So from a legislative perspective, I think next year may be more busy depending on what happens with the scoping plan and this year's activities. But in terms of legislative activity, there's not a whole lot going on. But the legislature did act. They committed the state to offsets, whereas when the program was developed way back in 2010, offsets were a creation of CARB. And now offsets are statutorily authorized under 398. So those that are concerned about offsets, certainly there's things you can do to improve the program, but the idea that offsets are going to go away, I think is pretty remote at this point. They are cost-effective strategies. Anything that raises the price of carbon, debatably as a 2/3 vote of the legislature, which would be very hard to get. So that may be a live legal question, but it's enough of a question that, in my mind, offsets are not at risk in the legislature anytime soon. So what are some of the things I think that are on the table for the scoping plan? Certainly, the Secretary of Cal EPA committed to a review of the program. And when you review cap and trade, you, by default, have to include offsets. So I think the role of offsets, the Offset Protocol Task Force recommendations are up for discussion. But as I said, the fundamental place in the program for offsets, I think, is pretty secure. Because there's a broader, and this is just me speaking, there's a broader view of what climate mitigation strategies are about. And it's not just regulate industry, it's reduce emissions, get natural working lands involved, get co-benefits, get those entities that you don't actually regulate involved. And of those 200 million offsets that Jason was talking about, somebody had to finance it, somebody had to care enough, somebody had to verify, the communities had to get involved, there's permitting. So the offset world expands upon the regulations and what's happening at CARB. And then the final thing I'll say about policy is carbon neutrality is a key policy driver of what's going to happen in the scoping plan this time. The executive order that Governor Brown issued came after the last scoping plan. So this scoping plan will focus on carbon neutrality, and you can't talk about carbon neutrality without working land, sequestration, net zero offsets. So I think that'll be a very key discussion point over the next 12 to 18 months. And with that, Nancy, I can kick it back to you for roundtable.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And also thanks to Robert, who dropped into the chat the links for both the Offset Protocol Task and the request for public comment from USDA. So hopefully folks want to take a look at that. They now know where to find it. So I guess so just to kind of kick off a little bit on the roundtable, I mean, we now have in California a lot of experience with cap and trade and a fair amount of experience with offsets and what it takes to sort of so we've heard some perspectives about how they're used in the California market and where some of the opportunities and challenges around offsets. And of course, we're going to see in sort of another kind of round of discussion, as John was saying, with the scoping plan, whether anybody wants to tackle the sort of the question of offsets or no offsets. I think we'll still have to have the discussion about the sort of both the role and the impact that offsets are having in California, and then also, if anybody cares to speculate, sort of, and I think Robert, you sort of kicked it off a little bit. Discussion around addressing climate change takes on new life. Administration, sort of what lessons that California has learned might have an impact on some of the discussions at the national level. So, Jason, you want to try to give a little bit of the future looks like, and knowing that you are engaged in both some scope and other potential regulatory things, but if there's some view from CARB, you don't mind, Jason?
Sure. With my earlier caveat of we're careful not to put our hand, as Robert said, on the scale of anything before we brought it kind of a public process. Just before I'll jump into a little bit on just kind of where I think our next scoping plan process will be going. But before I do that, I just want to touch on something John said about authority. So yes, AB 398 did provide specific legislative direction on the quantitative usage limit for offsets, and I'd forgotten to mention that in my remarks. So that will cut in half for 2021 emissions through 2025, as John said. But AB 32 provided us authority and requirements for looking at how offsets could come into the program. So just wanted to clarify that we had that AB 32 provided that authority. We took the definitions of additional, real, permanent, verifiable, quantifiable, and enforceable, got those 6 memorized from the statute. So I think our design from the beginning has been from the legislation. AB 398 clearly put more specifics and requirements on percentage limits and DEBs. On the question of looking to the future, our last scoping plan took looked at our portfolio approach in California, which is important. We don't have just one climate program, we have a suite of them. And it looked to how we could cost effectively get to our 2030 target, which is 40% below 1990 levels in 2020 by 2030. This next scoping plan will look at 2045 to get to carbon neutrality. And as John laid out, that's really looking at how do we get the deepest reductions possible from our fossil sector, from all our fossil fuel emissions, as well as looking at our land sector and what are the different mechanisms we have currently for those pieces of the assessment, from our regulations to incentive programs, and what maybe other things do we need to look at. So that's really what our scoping plan is going to be looking at, of what's the suite of policies, how are our suite of policies doing, and how do we get to that 2045 goal. I don't want to presuppose, I don't know exactly what goes in the scoping plan. That process will kick off later this year. The Environmental Justice Advisory Committee solicitation for applications closes Monday. So I guess my overall statement would be stay tuned, stay involved. The next year and a half will be very busy on working through what that means. I also think as we look towards what how our programs have performed to get us below our targets so far, what does that provide as lessons or things that we can share with other jurisdictions? I mean, that's something that we do frequently. So seeing the U.S. commitments yesterday was very exciting. So I hope that there's a lot more information sharing and discussions on mechanisms to get to all these really hard to get to objectives.
Thanks, Jason. Robert, did you have a flavor of some of the things that are going on in sector? It as we've been talking to carbon neutrality and how do you engage the working lands and others in
Certainly, thank you, Nancy. So I think there's a couple of ways you can look at and think about things. And so when you're thinking about natural working lands, you can either take it from a cap and trade perspective or from like a greenhouse gas reduction fund perspective. And the state's done a really good job on both sides. And so if we take a second and think about the California climate investments using the greenhouse gas reduction funds, there's been tremendous benefit in investments in dairy digesters, in alternative manure management projects, in soil health projects, in all kinds of different areas. And in many ways, it has been a proving ground of what works and how to scale things up and how to take things at larger levels. While significant money has gone into development of these projects, it still has just scratched the surface of what the potential is that's out there. And so we've got an opportunity now to expand that and that's a perfect example of the alternative manure management program, of where there's been a number of projects that have been worked on that program, and now we created a protocol and we can drive that to further adoption. No matter which way we think about this, there is going to be a need for investment in these practices. They're not going to happen themselves, and so I always think about it as kind of like the way we think of the overall scoping plan in the state, is that there's multiple levers we can pull to be able to create reductions. And so in some cases, we can do that through offsets. In some cases, we can do that through other programs in the scoping plan. What I like about offsets is it does a couple of things. One is that it is less limited in its ability to reduce. or to create projects. There's a market driver, there's a market opportunity. It's not limited by budget, even though it is limited by how much can be used. The second thing is that it allows California to export its knowledge and drivers outside of California. And you know, we have for over 50 years been the incubator of environmental leadership across the country. And so what we do here doesn't stay here. And we can get all kinds of producers, agricultural producers across the country to implement practices and to bring them along this journey to meet our overall target. And that's going to be necessary. And so what we've learned here can be applied everywhere. And that's why I'm happy and excited about that there is half of the offsets are here in the state, but the other half can be anywhere else in the country.
Thanks. Sorry, my computer froze there for a minute, so I think I missed something. John, do you want to jump in on sort of what does the future look like here, and carbon neutrality?
Yeah, I think I'll just say briefly to touch on the fact that you can't have carbon neutrality discussions without talking about net reductions and offsets. So I think the future is strong. And as Robert said, if you look at what others are doing, there's a cap and reduce in Oregon. There's a cap and trade bill that'll get voted on this weekend in Washington. Offsets are part of the mix. And the idea of DEBs, that's also been exported. And so, you know, the fact that the environmental justice community and the EJAC have traditionally not been super in favor of offsets, to put it lightly, means that it will be a discussion point. So as Jason said, it'll be a busy 12 to 18 months. But I think when it's all said and done, the work of the Offset Protocol Task Force, some of the incremental benefits, how to maximize the utilization rate, because even at 8%, we as a state were not using all the offsets that we could have. There was some risk, and some of the larger users were using offsets, but it didn't filter down to everybody. So the benefits of offsets and the advantages that you can achieve by using them, I think, is just going to grow as time goes and people get more comfortable with them. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I think it's a positive place for offsets.
Thank you. And I think we've touched a little bit on sort of kind of where we are now and where we might go in the future. If anybody wanted to talk a little bit about sort of post 2030 and what we might see with offsets in the after 2030, anybody wants to jump in on that?
So I'll start. I know, as Robert mentioned, there's a whole lot of stuff going on with agriculture, right? Nitrate emissions, and there's areas that we haven't yet touched. I think it's a little hard to talk about post 2030 cap and trade because we're not quite sure what that's going to look like. But you know, there's a whole infrastructure of finance and project developers and lands and communities around the country that will benefit from continued expansion of the offset program. And I just want to mention a couple things I was going to say earlier and didn't. When you talk about a ton of reduction, the benefit to the earth, to the atmosphere, is greater than that 1 ton that's credited. Jason and his team are conservative by nature. So all the offset protocols so if you're up here, you cut down just to be conservative because, as he said, it has to be additional, it has to be verifiable, it has to be enforceable. So that 1 ton of reduction that is credited in the program actually achieves a much greater environmental benefit. So when you look at the co-benefits, including water, air, economic, there's really no reason that offsets shouldn't have a robust policy perspective for post 2030, no matter what the actual cap and trade role is in California.
And I may add just a couple thoughts. I think those are good ones. I mean, I think from the existing projects that we have, and one of the requirements in particular for the forest protocol is for permanence. And so those projects are taking on a long-term commitment to get really good emission sequestration and emission reductions, as well as many other co-benefits. And those projects have taken that long-term commitment for at least 125 years. So the end of a 25-year crediting period, they still have 100 years of additional monitoring verification. I think that factors into how projects are financed and thought about, but I think that clearly is a long-term benefit. For our carbon neutrality approach, in particular, looking at natural working lands, so that's through 2045 and beyond, it's looking at these different types of mechanisms, or we'll be looking at these different types of mechanisms to get those kind of planning and incentives in long-term investment. I think Robert touched on this for the ag sector. We're excited to see what comes out of the California Natural Resources Agency is leading an effort on a climate smart strategy that will feed into our thinking for different types of approaches and mechanisms to address the land sector. And that'll feed into the scoping plan processing and some of our thoughts under how to integrate that into the carbon neutrality approach. So I think, again, a lot of work will be going on into the scoping plan, but all that is looking beyond 2030. And I think that's really important for the land sector, for those that are doing offsets and kind of all the above.
And I don't think we can reach our targets, whether it is, well, I don't think we can reach our 2045 targets without the natural working land sector. Like we're going to have to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. And so, you can do that through nature-based solutions, or there are some longer-term industrial type solutions that are out there. And so, right now the nature-based ones are here and ready to go, and they can be implemented and make a large reduction now. And so, I think that we can't see a future climate change world or climate constrained world without that role of natural working lands contributing to the solution. They're going to have to pull all of that, what are we at, 420 ppm of CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to try to get through some of the questions in the chat, the Q&A. In the time we have left, I had a question about, I think for Jason, about, can you elaborate a little more on the DEBS requirement?
Yes, if I can get my microphone off. So AB 398, the statute that John talked about, had two specific changes to our offsets limits within the cap and trade program. The first was to reduce the amount that entities can surrender towards their compliance obligations. Our current program, again, through 2020 emissions that are due this year, is an 8% limit. So if a company had 100,000 metric tons of emissions, it could turn in 8,000 offsets maximum. That will drop in half to 4% from 2021 through 2025 emissions, and then go up to 6% from 2026 to 2030 emissions. Those are the numbers that were in the legislation. So I think the legislative history may be where to look. I see one question here was how those numbers were developed. I think I'd look to those legislative discussions. We implemented that in regulation per the legislative direction. The DEBS piece of that is the other part, and the direct environmental benefits means that when entities are surrendering instruments from 2021 emissions forward through 2030 emissions, no more than 1/2 of the credits they surrender can come from projects that don't provide direct environmental benefits. And I'm a lawyer by training, so I'm emphasizing the nuance on the double negative here. Essentially what that means is that compliance entities in cap and trade can surrender up to half of their overall offset limit from projects that don't provide direct environmental benefits. So folks think of those as out-of-state projects most of the time. They could surrender one credit if they wanted to, and that could be a non-DEBS credit. But if they maximize their percent limits, then they can only surrender up to half of the overall limit from a non-DEBS credits. So that's up to 2% essentially from 2021 to 2025 emissions, and up to 3% from 2026 to 2030 emissions. I can put in the chat our website that kind of walks through this. It also describes how out-of-state projects can apply to show they provide direct environmental benefits. We've had a couple of forest projects apply, and we've got the documentation on our issuance table that shows how they applied, what we assessed, and how we determined they do provide direct environmental benefits. But I'll provide that in the chat if it's helpful.
I think we had a couple of questions. I'm going to just try to paraphrase, because I think what they are the sort of one looking at sort of is the pool sort of shrinking, and then the second really around the pool or expanding. So there's a question about, are there specific type of offsets that are at higher risk of becoming business as usual, therefore no longer additional? And then a question really about the sort of process of adding types of projects into as acceptable offsets. So I don't know if anybody wants to try either of those or both.
I'm going to take the second question. If Robert or anyone wants to tackle it first. On how we assess offsets, and I think this goes to some of the other questions of I'll try to address the question, Nancy, on timing and on how we're assessing the task force recommendations. For us as a regulatory agency under the structure we have to assess any new type of offset protocol, we're looking to see, does it meet the statutory criteria? So can it be quantified? Has that demonstrated? Is it additional to practices that are already occurring and to legal structures? And we really take a really hard look at that. Offsets are meant to be conservative. They're meant to be rigorous. And once we determine, if we determine that there's a protocol type that we're interested in, we want to do that publicly. So we're not sending an advanced signal in either direction to one segment of the economy or to one business. We take a very, very careful look at how we do that. And I think that's evidenced by just the number of protocols we have to date. It's the same assessment we'll be doing with the task force recommendations. So my team is spending time to look through that document, to look through those recommendations. We take them very seriously. We are not limited to that document. That the AB 398 did not mandate that we take action on any recommendation. I mean, we'd have to start with a full rulemaking process to do so. But the thinking that went behind those is there's in-depth thinking, looking at existing voluntary protocols, and that's really the process we take with looking at any new type of protocol is does it meet those criteria? Has it been demonstrated to work? Has it been demonstrated to actually be able to generate credits? And that's kind of how we look at it. Timing wise, I don't have timing. We're looking at those recommendations. The final recommendations came in a little over a month ago. We're very grateful for those. And if and when we bring forward any new potential protocol type or changes to existing protocols, we'll do that through our regular, very full, transparent legal process. So, thanks.
I can take a stab at that as well. I think about additionality perspective. No one has ever been able to say what is the percentage at which something is no longer additional. And I think we're going to continue to struggle with that out into the future. But I think what we will see is that some of the protocols will max out and gradually decline. And ODS is a perfect example. If you don't expand the gases to other gases, there is a limited set of gases out there in the US, and those are the gases that can be destroyed. Once those are destroyed, they're gone. there were some questions about what protocols to consider, and I think there was some reference to the reserves soil enrichment protocol and the similar one with Vera, and I'd like to expand a little bit on the thinking of at least the ag group of the task force. And the charge in AB 398 was, does it work in California? Like, that was kind of the anchor. We had to prove that there was that California anchor. And while the reserve protocol was great, and I was a technical reviewer of the SCP, we really struggled with, how does it apply? Like, what crops can we do it? How can we apply it to California? Is there a project that's been created? How many have been piloted? Those are the things that really racked our brains. And I say that specifically with the experience from the rice protocol is that one of the challenges we had with the rice protocol is that we it was adopted by ARB before there was a voluntary project, before there was anything in the voluntary market. And I'm not saying that to point fingers at anybody in the process. It just that's a fact. There wasn't one out there. And I think going forward, it's important to get these protocols out there in the voluntary market. There were no credits that were issued under the forestry protocol version 1.0. The first credits were, I think it was 2.1. And that's an important point. Now, the forestry was a long time ago and a very early protocol, but very few credits get issued at 1.0. It's always 1.1, 1.5, 2.0, because we learn so much in it. No matter how good we are in designing these, it's different when you get on the ground. And so when you start thinking about it, at least from my perspective, if I were in Jason's shoes and I was looking to adopt a protocol, I'd look at, has it gone through its test run? Has it actually gone out there and created projects, and some of the things worked out? Because we don't have the time, and frankly, Jason and his team don't have the time to invest in a protocol that isn't going to have results. So we want ones that are going to give us climate results quickly, and that ARB staff can take up.
Just add one really quick thing here. I mean, the amount of time that Robert's talking about and the amount of effort and rigor behind an offset protocol is substantial, and it's really, really important for how offsets work. I just want to say, and I think this will go into some of the assessment we're going to do for natural working lands under the scoping plan process. That doesn't mean if something can't meet that rigor that it's not something that should be found to do, in particular for ag, in particular for a land sector. So I see, there's references to our greenhouse gas reduction fund, but I think there's an assessment that needs to be done, and CNRA and others are helping do this, of what other types of ways to help incentivize or finance these actions. So even if something doesn't meet the full offset rigor that's needed by law and for a market program, there's a lot of other opportunity and needs to be a lot of other support for all these actions. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in, Nancy, and we can get to the next topic since we'll have a few minutes. I was just going to agree with both Robert and Jason that it takes so much work that the next decision to move forward on a protocol just sort of has to be worth it, right? There's just a lot of effort that goes into it for everybody, and we want to make sure that it benefits the program. So just agreeing with the panelists.
All right, thanks. I guess maybe just a follow-up, and sort of we've been talking about it from the regulatory perspective, from the protocol development perspective. I wonder if anybody would want to offer some thoughts about what does it look like from the, I guess, the sort of consumer perspective, whether you're a regulated entity trying to figure out how to comply with cap and trade, or interested in sort of how well cap and trade or California is doing in meeting its goals. I wonder if anybody wanted to share some thoughts there about what does it look like from that side. I don't know, John, you work with a lot of the regulated industries.
Yeah, thanks.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
So, you know, from a regulated industry perspective, offsets are really important. And as we said, and as Jason mentioned, a protocol, when you buy an offset, you're sort of taking for granted all the work that went into it, that it's real, quantifiable, enforceable, because there's a market risk associated with that offset. So if I'm a regulated entity, I wouldn't want a protocol that is not robustly debated and sort of agreed upon, that it's going to be something that benefits the environment, because I have a compliance risk, I have a market risk, I have a reputation risk, and so when I buy an offset, especially if I buy a California compliance grade regulatory offset, I know what I'm getting, and so I think that's key to everything. Is it is a lot of work, but there's a reason, because California's program is followed by so many people, and like the LCFS and others, the people that are coming after California are going to build on California's shoulders. Why would Washington start from scratch? Their legislation talks about programs already being used and offsets already developed. So, you know, what California does really is a foundation for others. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. I don't know if anybody else wanted to weigh in. If not, I think we're getting close to the top of the hour here, and I wanted to just make sure that we give everybody a chance to sort of share some closing thoughts. I think we got through most of the types of questions that were in the Q&A, but if you all see something that you feel hasn't been addressed and would like to, if not, I'll just ask for some closing thoughts. Maybe Robert, we'll start with you. Kind of, given all the time you spent with the Offset Protocol Task Force, or what are your parting thoughts here? Sure.
I want to thank ARB for their support of this, and their making sure that this was a good process that we went through. I'm excited about the future going forward. I think that the task force came up with a lot of great recommendations, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity going forward. And I'm going to put in two final plugs. One, once again, to the USDA process. Really, it's, I know the folks at USDA working on this, and they really, really want your opinion. So on behalf of them, please do weigh in. I know that they've basically got their May blocked out to read it. And the other thing is one of the areas I would like to see us as a community focus on is around enteric fermentation. And we didn't talk a lot about it here, but there's been a lot of talk about methane. Half of all California's methane comes from cows. Half of that comes from enteric methane. There are some solutions out there. That, to me, is one of the places that we as a community have got to focus. So I'll leave it there.
And let me leave the last word, and so I'll speak first. It seems like, from a policy perspective, as was mentioned earlier, we seem to be treading the same ground. And if we're defending additionality, if we're defending the program, if there's a tax on should it even be in the program, it makes it much harder to move ahead. And so maybe we can get past that. Hopefully we can. I know from the offset developers' perspective, we've reached out to folks at ARB and offered to speak to the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, maybe have an educational agenda item. But the idea is, hopefully we get past the sort of the debates from the last decade, and we can talk about moving forward.
Jason, I'll give you the last word here. I think you want to leave
No pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah, I mean, for us within the cap and trade program, the offsets is a very important part of the program. We stand firmly behind it. We've defended it successfully in litigation and practice and implementation. So I think that goes without saying. I think the space for us to really look at how do we get to deep decarbonization across sectors and bringing in lands, that's the conversation going forward. That's much broader than offsets. It has to be. It's exciting, it's challenging, and I guess for those that are following ARB's process, our processes, stay tuned, be engaged, and we look forward to working with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thanks, John and Robert. And yeah, I think I'd say, first of all, I learned a lot from this session, so I want to thank you and thank everybody who's asked questions and been participating. Yeah, interesting to see sort of, I think as you've all touched on, sort of, we've had a discussion about offsets in California. We've gotten to a certain point, but the future is a really interesting, there's some really interesting developments, and I think the potential maybe to change the conversation a little bit and really focus on sort of the role of agriculture and working lands and helping California meet its climate goals, and what are those tools, and maybe, you know, offsets are one of them, and there may be others, but it is definitely, I think, a little bit of a potential to change some of the conversation. So I'm sure there will be more to come in both this conference and in future conferences to talk about carbon offsets and what we've learned and what we can share with the rest of the world. So thank you on behalf of NACW and all participants for a great panel. Thanks, everybody.
Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy. Great job. Thanks all.